Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Godzilla Minus One from 2023. So, let's talk about Godzilla and kaiju movies and monster movies in general, because that's all going to have to be touched on a little bit here. I am not the biggest Godzilla fan for any other reason than I just wasn't something I was exposed to all that much. But even when I was a little kid, I knew people who were really into Godzilla, and I know people now who are really into Godzilla. And it's just a franchise that has been difficult for me to ever approach. I think in part because I have some preconceived notions of both what it is and can be and what it really can mean. In its original form, this sounds like I'm going to launch into a lecture, but I promise this is limited. In its original form, Godzilla was very much a movie being made in reaction to the horrors of living in Japan in the post-World War II era. It's generally looked at as a narrative about understanding both war and, in particular, nuclear war, and the devastation both physically and socially and culturally to a nation that has basically undergone horrible wartime devastation, as well as is going through a cultural revolution as a result of basically some underlying elements of the culture being destroyed, in a sense. And in its more recent iterations, or at least the ones that were coming out in the 90s in particular, and particularly out of Hollywood and the West, a lot of those narratives, to my understanding, very much disappeared. This is a whole other topic of conversation that I'm not particularly well versed in terms of kaiju movies as a genre and the various adaptations that happened both in Japan, in the US, and elsewhere, and what the whole genre really means. I think I've talked about kaiju in some context before, but I don't remember exactly what it was. I'll put a note or a link if I remember in the comments. But Godzilla has always been really interesting to me because of this metaphorical representation, that it is a physical manifestation of great emotional feeling that comes from, or at least originally came from, a very uniquely Japanese experience. That's a whole lot of elements that I'm not particularly. It's hard for me to fully understand, but I really want to understand it because I think it's really interesting, especially given that it's such an enduring metaphor and such an enduring IP. So I've heard about this movie a bunch from a bunch of different people, mostly not from people who were particularly into Godzilla prior, as being a really good film. And by all accounts, it seems to have done extremely well, despite being a fairly low budget, about $12 million, I think is what it's quoted at. And I think it deserves a lot of praise. This is a really interesting film. And while I have skimmed past some of the more recent iterations, I've actually seen the one that came out in the 2000s from the Hollywood. That thing is awful. But some of the more modern iterations, especially out of Hollywood, have not been very not my taste at a glance. This is a very different sort of film, and in a lot of ways seems to return, at least narratively, to the roots of the IP. This is a movie that is set directly in the end of World War II and in the a couple of years that followed, and is very directly representative of some of those original ideas. surrounding surrounding Godzilla. I've never actually seen the original one, which I believe is from 1954, something like that. So I cannot compare it directly, and my other Godzilla exposure has been limited enough that I couldn't compare it directly to any other particular one. So I don't know how this necessarily compares, but this is a really interesting thing, a really interesting film, both for how it uses Godzilla in its traditional way and also how it adapts some of what I see as those sort of the literary use and that metaphorical use from the original setting into a more modern context as well. To that end, I think the plot is fantastically well constructed, and while not particularly subtle, the underlying stories and the representative narrative that's sort of underlying the main narrative arc, I think is very modern in very many ways, or at the very least, the parts that aren't particularly modern or not uniquely modern are still resonate very much to this day. This still very clearly has a narrative about the horrors of war and the sort of guilt and suffering and trauma that belongs to not only soldiers but people of nations who are involved in war. And while I have to imagine that this is, while very direct, still has a lot more subtlety to its presentation, if only because the cinema narratives of the 1950s, regardless of where they were made, were not particularly complex. This cinema was used in a different sort of way, and cinematic expectations were different. So to see some very nuanced and careful takes on sort of exploring the traumas of soldiers coming out of World War II, coming back to homes that were destroyed, families who were completely, who lost everything, including possibly their lives. That is so much to dig into already. And when you have this literal and metaphorical monster that is coming to threaten you once again when you have so little in the first place, I think that's a really interesting there's a really interesting use of it as a metaphor for like sort of both survivor's guilt and the sort of feeling of almost wishing that you hadn't been a survivor in such horrible circumstances, as well as the idea of the everyday stresses of the little daily things in life being sometimes so hard to do or to get, or like mere survival seems like such an unbelievable task. And the metaphor of your life could be destroyed at any second by the smallest thing, that your life is so fragile, I think that's a really interesting and enduring metaphor, not only for war and its aftermath, but so many other things. I also think this movie has a level of introspection, a psychological introspection, that basically wouldn't have existed in the 1950s, and even probably not have existed 20 years ago, because of the current cultural climates and the new understandings of psychology and public health and all these other different things. And so to see this movie take relatively careful, nuanced, and subtle takes on subtle but direct takes on these are the ways in which suffering is experienced and passed between people. That's all really a strength of this film. The exploration between various characters, how they experience their world, how they experience the literal and metaphorical Godzilla, and what the world around them sort of means to them and the people around them and how they relate to those people in their world. I don't want to talk too much about the narrative in specifics because I'm afraid of spoiling too much. But I will say that I think the physical form of Godzilla also is done really well. This is a bit of a callback to a more classical Godzilla, not the sort of oldest version as I understand it. And I know just enough about, or I've seen just enough of Godzilla media before to know that this is like, this design that was used in this film is very reminiscent of a couple of specific versions, in particular some of the older ones, and that it, you know, shirks a lot of the sort of, let's say, 80s and 90s more cheesy, more action oriented things. I think Godzilla, at whatever size and scale, shows very clearly a sense of threat. It doesn't need to move fast. It doesn't need to do anything in particular to make itself understood. It's an enduring visual metaphor for a reason, that you understand from the shape of it, from the texture of it, from its spines, its tail, the glow from it, that all of these things are immediately understandable, like visual language to understand the kind of threat that it represents, whether, again, physical or metaphorical. And the way that its abilities and drive are shown in the film, I think, are much more much more representative, of that sort of older, more metaphorical Godzilla, less one driven by specific motivations. It's more animalistic. It's more of a lurking, looming, uncontrollable threat than something to be really understood. So I think the overall arc of the sort of the Godzilla part of the movie is pretty simple, but works really well. I think it serves well to play against this sort of other narrative about the individual people who are living around the areas where Godzilla is, or have had the experiences with Godzilla before. Those two sort of side-by-side narratives are tied together, not like really, really parallel, but they're tied together well to sort of feed off each other in, I think, a positive way that works well. But it's not going to like wow you with its complex narrative. A lot of the tropes are sort of tried and true, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that because it executes them extremely well. To the point of talking about the design of Godzilla and the the visuals of the film in general, the cinematography is fantastic. I really enjoy a ton of what they do with this film. There's a few things that I think are a little bit too Hollywood for me. A few sort of like sweeping digital shots that are sort of almost unnecessary, whereas there are some other shots that feel, whether they were done practically or not, feel very practical in their presentation. I think one of the promotional pictures that got circulated a lot was the image of Godzilla with an open mouth, like following this boat, and I think that is like a fan. It's unfortunate that that's a promo shot because it's so much better in the film itself, and there are a lot of shots like that that I think give such a sense of scale and space and they're super legible. If there's one thing this film is, it's very, very legible, very readable. It's easy to see what's going on. This is not a movie that is mired in darkness or excessive effects or crazy flashiness. It knows exactly what it wants to show. It shows it clearly and directly, and shows something that a lot of people seem to forget, especially in Hollywood, that you can make something horrifying in the bright light of day. You don't have to rely on scare tactics and things to make something scary or horrifying. And that goes for all other kinds of elements of the visuals as well. I mean, I think this has a variety of interior and exterior shots that are all presented really well. Naturalistic lighting, good use of sort of light and color, and no aggressive color grading. And it's sometimes hard to tell for me what effects are done digitally versus practically. And for the most part, I don't really care, because whichever one they are, they're done so well that it's just very visually engaging. There are even some things that I'm pretty sure are done digitally, but have been processed in such a way that they harken back to the stop motion animations that they would do in the 50s and 60s, not only in Godzilla, but in so many other things, where use of sort of choppy frames and things like that, even in digital processing, to sort of give that same sense. And it works really well. It's not like it's only there as an homage. It genuinely sort of gives that sort of otherworldliness to Godzilla as well, that serves the sort of horror of it as well. It's a little inconsistent. Some of the CGI and some of the effects are a little bit inconsistent. There's a few things here and there where I can say, oh, that could have been polished up a little bit more, or I wish they just had omitted that shot or something like that. But there are so many others that are so good that it really, the ones that don't work, I ignore. What else can I talk about here? It's just a really solid film all around. I think even if you're not into Godzilla, not into kaiju, not into historical narratives, not into like character study, which this thing has all of those things together. I think it's a very impressively made film, and all of those other things are complemented by a soundtrack that I think works very, very well. And sort of wraps the whole thing up in a nice sort of audio soundscape that goes for the audio effects as well. The soundtrack in particular is notable to me because it uses the original Godzilla score as it's basically a reorchestrating of the original Godzilla score, that classic, the classic riff that I'm not even gonna sing because I'll probably screw it up, but it's very recognizable if you've ever seen anything Godzilla before. And I'm just really happy overall with this film. It's a nice surprise, especially after there being, I think, 3 or 4 different Godzilla films in the last 10 years, several of which were did not do particularly well and were said not to be particularly good. I do know that Shin Godzilla, which came out I think in 2016, was supposed to be good. Was it that one? I'm not sure. Anyway, Godzilla is really interesting to me, and I like to see how it's used as an IP. I think it's often maligned or even looked down on, and I'm not even going to say that's not fair, because sometimes a lot of the things that have come out of the franchise have not been particularly worth taking seriously. But I think this is a very serious, honest, earnest movie that has things to say, and will genuinely at sometimes tug at your heartstrings. It's a truly like emotional movie on multiple occasions. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate this new take on Godzilla that's still a refresher of the old. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.